Hello and welcome to Season 2, Episode 8 of the Talking Central Banks podcast with me, Karan Merishi. This platform is exclusively dedicated to everything central banking, monetary economics, and policy technicals for observers across the world. Today, we will be talking about the effects of geopolitics on US macros and the Fed's challenges in dealing with current volatility in the domestic economy. Our guest tonight is Michael Green, who serves as the chief strategist of Simplify Asset Management, which has over $10 billion in assets under management. Michael has been a student of markets and market structure for nearly 30 years. His proprietary research into the shift from actively managed portfolios and investment funds to systematic passive investment strategies has been presented to the Fed, the BIS, the IMF, and numerous other industry groups and associations. Michael joined Simplify in April 21 and managed macro strategies at Thiel Macro LLC, an investment firm that manages the personal capital of Peter Thiel. Prior to Thiel, Michael founded Ice Farm Capital, a discretionary global macro hedge fund seeded by Soros Fund Management. From 2006 to 2014, Michael founded and managed the New York office of Canyon Capital Advisors, a $23 billion multi-strategy hedge fund based in Los Angeles, where he established their global macro strategies, managing in excess of $5 billion of exposure across equity, credit, FX, commodity, and derivative markets. In addition to his work as a market theorist and portfolio manager, Michael has been noted for his work as a public speaker and financial media participant. He is a graduate of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and is a CFA charter holder. Welcome to the show, Mike.
It's a pleasure to be here, Karan. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Great to have you on the show, Mike. So to start with, you recently suggested that the Fed is behind the curve and think that the FOMC must go for at least 4 rate cuts in 2026. This is in absolute opposition to the narrative built by a certain quarter of analysts, Mike, who are actually proposing rate hikes given the geopolitical reality facing the economy. The question is, however, that the economy remains robust, with the Q1 growth possibly topping 5%, incremental job numbers crossing 170,000 in March, with the PCE, both core and headline, crossing 3%, well over the Fed's 2% target rate. If the Fed ignores the inflation number, discounts the belief that the elevated inflation number might not be transitory, and eventually cut rates, the concern is that inflation expectations then might be negatively impacted if inflation remains elevated in the near term. On the other hand, Mike, if the Fed chooses not to cut rates and remains status quo, households might come under additional pressure given the implications of tariff wars and the Iran situation. What are your thoughts on this quagmire? And in your opinion, what is the best way forward for the Fed?
So let's see. First of all, a couple of things. One, what I've emphasized is that the Fed is actually somewhat trapped because the economy is bifurcated into what is called the K-shaped economy, where interest rate policy no longer is a purely straightforward demand management exercise. When you have high levels of debt to GDP, an increase in interest rates translates, and is particularly skewed if you are heavy in the front end. That translates into what's called the interest income channel. We've had roughly $500 billion of incremental interest expense that's been created by the Federal Reserve hiking interest rates that now flows through to a segment of our society, in particular the older population and the wealthier populations that had accumulated relatively significant cash balances in the form of things like money market funds. When you raise interest rates, you're increasing effectively the fiscal stimulus that's flowing to that subset of the population. This has been a key driver of that K-shaped economy. It's supported spending at the top end and challenged spending at the lower end for a variety of reasons. The most obvious one being credit availability is beginning to deteriorate rapidly for those with reduced incomes. I think the Fed is very much trapped by its idea that it's fighting the last war, that it's trying to live up to, the quote unquote standards of Paul Volcker in terms of fighting inflation without understanding how radically different the world actually is today. And I think that they're extremely concerned about their credibility from a standpoint of what do people think about them as compared to what have they actually done. Um, it's a very heavy burden to be in Washington, D.C., and to be viewed as the Federal Reserve that sacrificed the decades of relatively contained inflation that we experienced. That biases them towards, continuing to maintain interest rates higher than I believe they should be. And so they're a little bit trapped. They should cut rates to support the interest rate sensitive portions of the economy, like housing and lower income individuals. But at the same time, if they do cut rates in response to economic weakness, that is likely to introduce an additional form of economic weakness coming from the higher end consumer. In terms of the risks of expectations, I just unfortunately have to call, I think the technical term is bullshit on that. What we have seen very clearly is that actual inflation expectations in the form of traded inflation swaps have remained, have remained very, very contained, and have candidly been below the levels of pre-GFC for an extended period of time, effectively expressing a 2% target with a little bit of a margin of safety, which is not dissimilar to the premium for implied volatility over realized volatility. You're going to see that anytime you have an insurance policy. But if I were to just share my screen quickly to look at the current inflation feedback loops versus the forward inflation feedback loops, can I share my screen quickly? So the easiest way to derive this is to look at a 1-year inflation swap versus what's called a one-year inflation swap, basically 1 year out into the future. What we saw in 21-22 was both were rising as we effectively had a supply chain problem and a demand side problem that meant that it was likely that inflation was going to be persistent for a period of time, even if it was going to peak relatively, in a relatively rational way. You can see right around the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we peaked on the 1-year inflation swap. We were significantly lower on the 1-year. And since then, we have largely retreated on that forward inflation metric to a very stable level, offset by interjections like the tariffs introduced in 2025, and now the oil price shock that we're seeing through the closing of Straits of Hormuz. But there's no signs whatsoever that longer term inflation expectations are being disrupted by these events. And the Fed should have very high confidence to effectively look through what I would argue is a supply driven phenomenon as compared to a demand driven phenomenon. We heard lots of hyperbolic statements about high tariffs passing through to high prices in 2025. I think it's really critical for people to understand that despite introducing the highest tariffs in nearly 100 years, we actually saw CPI come out of 2025 roughly a half point lower than it was going into 2025. In other words, Scott Bessent was correct. Ultimately, the tariffs proved deflationary in their underlying construction because they destroyed demand alongside it. This oil shock is no different. What we're actually seeing is forward inflation expectations remain stable. If the Fed were to hike interest rates, it would almost certainly cause those to fall even lower, potentially returning us back into the zero lower bound trap that we experienced from give or take 2010 to 2020.
So this actually means that inflation is transitory, in your opinion, Mike?
I think inflation was transitory. It could not have been much more transitory. In fact, if we look across places like Sweden, Europe, et cetera, we've seen inflation fall back down very, very quickly to effectively deflationary type levels. Again, anytime you have an oil shock, that's going to manifest itself in higher realized inflation. We know exactly why that is. Oil is a relatively inelastic good. Most CPI baskets are constructed on a fixed basket methodology, so there is no substitution on an intra-year basis. And so if the price of gasoline rises mechanically, that's going to push up the reported inflation numbers, even as consumers effectively cut back in areas that they can no longer afford because of the higher gasoline prices. And so that's not going to be properly captured in a single period CPI metric. It will be better captured in metrics that allow substitution like PCE, et cetera. But again, there's just so many assumptions that are at this point baked into how we calculate CPI or PCE that I'm not sure that the data really tells us what we want to know. Really good example is the asset management space, where according to BLS measures, the prices for asset management have soared in the past several years. That's empirically not true. Nobody's raised their prices, but because we impute the price of asset management services to the underlying level of the asset itself, if I charge 1% on an S&P holding and the S&P rises, that's perceived as a price increase. I don't think anybody in the industry thinks about it that way. I don't think consumers think about it that way, but that is what's flowing through in the methodology. Likewise, things like owner's equivalent rent and rent of primary shelters have smoothing mechanisms built into them where they're effectively reflecting a 3-year moving average. If I use metrics that incorporate real-time rent increases or real-time housing price changes, those are done by firms like Trueflation. They're done by firms, by entities like the Dallas Fed just did an exercise on this. Penn State has it as well. And they all come to the same conclusion, which is that the actual levels of inflation that we're experiencing are about 1.6 to 1.7%.
Right.
That is not at all consistent with the level of Fed funds rate that we currently have.
OECD, by the way, Mike suggests that inflation might hit 4.2% this year and expects risks of market repricing. Also, the March 18th dot plot is suggesting that most FOMC participants are expecting the PCE to average over 2.7% as compared to what they were expecting in December, when this number was closer to 2.4%. What do you think, Mike?
But again, I think that's an obvious implication of a gasoline and oil price shock. The question is whether the Fed should actually be responding to that through what's effectively a demand management and supply restriction response. If I hike interest rates, it makes financing incremental development in the oil and gas space more expensive. And the question is, am I actually impacting demand in a meaningful way when I do that? The point I would raise is it really depends. If I hike interest rates by 25 basis points or I fail to lower them by 25 basis points, what's the implication to that? I think the much more concerning area that we should be focused on is the rising levels of credit distress that exist in households and in smaller corporations. Those are areas that are actually quite sensitive to that financing or that perceived availability of financing. The Fed basically pushing through tighter financial conditions is not at all helpful to solving that part of the equation. And as I indicated before, if they were to hike interest rates, we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of $7.5 trillion in money market accounts that would receive a direct benefit of a 25 basis point increase in that, actually increasing the quantity of disposable income for those who are at the higher income level and tend to skew older due to their asset mix. I don't see how that's helpful in the least.
You talk about the current hoarding of gold, Mike, as a hedging commodity amidst current volatility as a possible system risk precedent. Can you talk more about this hunch?
Well, I'm not so sure it's a hunch as much as it's kind of a mathematical property. Under the Biden
Right.
administration, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we effectively told them that treasuries were not viewed as a safe asset for them to accumulate foreign reserves in because they could be taken by the United States. That forced China, Russia, and others who are interested in conducting policy that may not be in line with the United States to move from hoarding treasuries as a safe asset to hoarding gold. That really played through from about 2022 to about 2024. During that time period of 22 to 24, we saw a lot of Western investors selling gold, either to buy things like Bitcoin or to buy stocks because gold had underperformed for a period of time. And in late 24, 25, we saw that reverse. We basically saw Western investors decide to join the horde of those buying gold, when you have two major buyers, both state governments that are interested in accumulating resources and reserves in a currency other than the US dollar, and Western investors effectively saying, hey, we want to chase this price as a risk on asset, you're going to see the sort of price movement that you saw. It's a relatively small market, somewhere in the neighborhood of $25 trillion in total assets versus give or take $400 trillion in total financial assets. It's not surprising that when people try to push more into a relatively small market, they're going to cause the price to appreciate. And that will in turn lead to all sorts of narratives, right? That, we're going to engage in massive quantities of money printing, which may happen. Or that the US dollar is losing dominance, or you'll see charts that show, gold replacing US treasuries as the reserve asset in dollar value. Well, that's pretty straightforward. If you do it on a market value basis and the price goes up a whole bunch, regardless of whether central banks have bought a lot, it
Right.
can increase significantly in terms of its share, but it doesn't actually mean, anything particularly in a greater global economy framework. It just is it just is price action that's caused by people effectively buying and selling the underlying asset. Now, with all that said, if we are increasingly moving to a world where the rest of the world is unwilling to hold treasuries or unable to hold treasuries, will we continue to see this type of action? Absolutely. Could we see policy from the US government that makes treasuries even less attractive for foreigners to hold? Among those would be things like balancing global trade budgets. Absolutely. That would be a net negative for demand for treasuries. Depending on how it's structured, is that decline in the US's net trade deficit, is it being driven by the recovery of US manufacturing productions and therefore income for domestic workers, or is it being caused by an economic slowdown? If it's being caused by an economic slowdown, the simple answer is that everybody's going to end up suffering. Exporting countries will end up suffering more because their source of aggregate demand has decreased significantly. But everybody suffers under that framework. And again, I keep coming back to, if we get to that point and the Federal Reserve is forced to hike interest rates to prevent people from selling the dollar, this is the classic EM framework of having to step in and defend your currency, then we'd be in a radically different world. But I just don't see any evidence of that yet.
Very interesting, Mike. Taking our attention to financial regulations, Mickey Bowman recently talked about the new banking regulations during an interview with Fox Business. It seems that the regulatory obligations may increase for GSIBs, especially the Basel rule implementation.
Mhm.
On the other hand, Mike, smaller banks, based on asset thresholds, will apparently receive concessions in risk weights as a motivation to participate in the housing mortgage market. Apparently, post Dodd-Frank, commercial bank participation has reduced in the segment, which is now dominated by non-banks. So, Mike, what are your thoughts on these regulatory tweaks and the impact on the macroeconomy going ahead?
Well, I think unfortunately we've gotten to the degree of messing around where we basically have to mess around to try to correct prior mistakes. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis, mortgages became a quote unquote scary and risky asset. We put fairly significant barriers to non-agency issuance of mortgages. That had two impacts. One is it distinctly favored those that had captive mortgage lenders, i.e., the large national home builders. And so we've seen a collapse in small home builders, a rise in large national home builders as a proportion of total housing built, not dissimilar to what's happened in places like the UK, et cetera. And banks have by and large stepped out of the business, right? It's mostly mortgage originators who are then selling the product effectively under an agency sponsored basis. Now we're trying to step in and fix that. The problem, I would argue, is that our community banks, by and large, have moved away from the traditional types of credit scoring or credit analysis. This would require them to build out capabilities that they've allowed to atrophy. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to say we're going to rejuvenate local banks by allowing them to add additional risk to their portfolios. And we're going to try to slow the growth of the major multinational banks like Citibank, Chase, et cetera, by putting a higher capital charge onto their business model. On net, I think that's relatively favorable. I would prefer to see lots of small banks because of the redundancy feature that creates and effectively the robustness that is created when you have lots of individuals with a moderate degree of skill working to allocate credit. Problems are
Right.
effectively limited to the size of any one institution or, quote unquote, collective behavior components to it, whereas much bigger problems can occur once you enter into a too big to fail banking framework.
Right.
Um, but to me, this is just more, fiddling around rather than saying, what is the actual role of banks? What is the role that we want them to occupy within our society? How do we want to manage the idea of monopolization or market concentration? If you are a client of JP Morgan, for example, Chase, you are now experiencing zero deposits again, right? Even though the Fed is
Right.
paying them, give or take, almost 4%. Sorry, I've got a very active dog who doesn't like the mailman. Uh, that 4% that JP Morgan or 3.5% that JP Morgan is earning on their deposits at the Federal Reserve are not being passed through to their customers for the very simple reason that JP Morgan has extraordinary market power. They emerged after the
Yeah.
global financial crisis as the quote unquote safe banker. So if you're going to put $1 million to work with somebody or put $1 million into a safe deposit area, JP Morgan is about as safe as it gets, and people are willing to forego the income associated with that. That's pure market power. And the solution to
Right.
market power is antitrust enforcement. And unfortunately, that's what we refuse to engage in. What we really should be doing is likely breaking up many of these major banks and shrinking the size of them so that we don't need these types of bizarre interventions. But we're not yet willing to do that.
I was actually talking to a European analyst, Mike, and he had the opinion that the American banks are more competitive because the Basel rules don't apply to them much as compared to the European banks. Do you think this is going to change once these regulations are applicable to the GSIBs?
I'm not highly confident in that for the very simple reason that I think by and large American policy is increasingly set by the largest corporate lobby capability. I would be surprised to see us hamstring our national champion banks in a manner that would allow other regions to become more competitive.
Yeah. Mike, keen to know your thoughts on the situation pertaining to the private credit fund market at this time. I know you've talked a lot about this previously. Do you see any parallels with the GFC going ahead?
I think there are obviously parallels. So we have a segment of the credit market that has grown very rapidly. Private credit has exploded on the scene from basically non-existent prior to 2008 to today. It has a tremendous footprint, both in financing things like private equity, and in terms of providing various forms of consumer credit. Private credit is largely behind the buy now, pay later phenomenon, which is a way of sidestepping credit card regulations, and led to effectively a underreporting of consumer credit distress for an extended period of time. That's turning into a primary risk in the private credit space. Other areas where it has played a significant role is the financing of securitizations. We've seen this play a critical role in things like used auto financing. Um, and the long and short of it is it appears that the flood of capital into the space materially lowered lending standards. The reasons behind that are really straightforward. Again, it flows back to capital and regulatory frameworks. If you are a large bank and you decide to lend to Joe's Pizza Shack, that has a high risk weight. It's expensive to lend to that
Right.
small business. It is very cheap to lend to KKR, which can then go buy Joe's Pizza Shack as part of a horizontal roll up. And so
Yeah.
we've seen an explosion of lending into the what's called non-depository financial institution, which is really just banks lending to the shadow banking
Right.
system. And this has been a critical contributor to the relative healthiness of the consumer spending outlook. Incremental sources of capital that are available for all sorts of financing, as well as an unwillingness to recognize defaults and delinquencies, because that would be contra message in terms of fundraising, has led to an explosion of what are called uh, loss management exercises, LMEs, rather than bankruptcies. If we look at the companies that are smaller, we've seen a surge in bankruptcies over the past several years that is on par or exceeding the pace that preceded the global financial crisis. The only time period that it hasn't exceeded yet is the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis, basically the March 2009 quarter, in which we saw elevated bankruptcies as we approach kind of the final liquidation phase. But we're already seeing extraordinary levels of distress amongst companies below kind of $500 million in total outstanding financial assets. We've seen an explosion in the delinquencies and defaults amongst more exposed households, those that fall below kind of the 75th percentile in terms of income. And it's been particularly skewed towards smaller and startup, smaller businesses, startup businesses, and younger households. They are the ones that went into COVID effectively thinking that they were going to see many of their forms of debt, like student loan debt, purged. Instead,
Yeah.
we saw that retained. And as those payments came back on, we just saw an absolute explosion of delinquencies and defaults. Their ability to take on debt during the time period in which student loans were deferred and not reported allowed them to go out and buy relatively high-priced cars at relatively high-priced lending terms. They're now delinquent and defaulting on those at extraordinary levels. The buy now, pay later phenomenon allowed them to skip the credit reporting of credit cards. We're now seeing that begin to default at extraordinarily high levels. And so I think we
Yeah.
just unfortunately see the tentacles of private credit throughout our society. The one that I think people are growing aware of that raises true systemic risk is the exposure within insurance companies. We're discovering that the levels of indebtedness and leverage that has been deployed to support private credit as an asset class is far higher than people believed. Unfortunately, many of the assets that the older generations own include things like insurance policies to pay for extended care facilities, often to private equity entities. If you see delinquencies and defaults or inability to meet those obligations, that means suddenly the boomers are going to be struggling to figure out where they live, right?
Right.
Because you're an unsecured creditor against that type of indebtedness. So we simply don't know how pervasive this is going to become, but it does have many of the same uh, characteristics of the opaque nature of financing and securitization that contributed to the global financial crisis.
So do you think we might see a repeat of that episode, maybe of not that magnitude, but do you see, are we
Well,
close to that situation?
yeah, I think that there's two really critical ways of thinking about leverage, right? One way of thinking about leverage is how much debt do I have actually declared? And the other, what is my off-balance sheet liabilities? Included in my off-balance sheet liabilities are feeding myself, right? If I don't feed myself, I can't meet any other obligation. Maintaining decent levels of health, right? That is a liability that doesn't show up as an actual obligation, but I presume that assets are going to generate income that allows me to cover those expenses. If the assets don't cover those expenses, now I am levered to those obligations in a way I hadn't previously thought of. I either have to allow them to lapse or I have to meet those, which means I have to meaningfully reduce my discretionary spending elsewhere. And I think that form of leverage is actually worse due to the aging of the population than it was in the global financial crisis. We have more
Right.
seniors who are closer to the point that if their assets fail to materialize in either income generation or services generation, something like a long-term contract for assisted living, then you're going to see a scramble. And, that is what I would argue is where the leverage sits this time, much more so than banks being leveraged 60 times, for example.
Well, now to the P-star resistance, Mike. In your recent commentary, you suggested that the new poverty line is not $32,000, but actually $140,000 due to rising childcare costs and elevated living costs. This was a viral post read by many analysts across the world. Can you elaborate on this line of thinking, Mike?
Yeah, sure. So, first, kind of the most important thing to emphasize is that when we're talking about that $140,000 level, I was specifically identifying a two-income earner, two-child household. So, a household of four where both parents work and they have relatively young children. The reason I was focusing on that is that there is a perplexing phenomenon in which we are seeing very low levels of household formation, very low levels of fecundity or reproduction, where people are choosing not to get married, choosing not to form households, choosing not to have children. We have a near record number of young adults that are living with their parents effectively in an extended childhood, and are unable to effectively launch themselves and get started. So I was evaluating it from that standpoint and looking at that household in particular. That's where the 140,000 emerges. If you have two income earners and two young children, you are going to have to seek something like childcare. Historically, that would have been provided by your parents or by neighbors or by a wife who stayed home. That's simply a physical impossibility in most households today, in particular because of the explosive cost of housing. Um, the statistics were unfortunately very plain, which is that unless you clear about $140,000 on a nationwide basis, and to be totally accurate, the most representative community in the United States is Lynchburg, Virginia. That level is about 100,000 there. But that is still so far above the official poverty line that it is worth emphasizing what that means. The poverty line exists for that family. It's currently about $32,000. So the gap between that 32,000 and 100,000 or 140,000 is extraordinarily high. The cost of childcare for two children, and again, if you are going to work, you are going to have to find childcare for those children. That on a nationwide basis alone is about $27,000. So the 32,000 is obviously not going to cut it if you need to go out and find childcare. That's before you pay for housing. That's before you pay for everything else. What that $100,000 or $140,000 level really refers to is what I call the precarity line, the point at which you can start saving, the point at which you don't actually need handouts from somebody in order to participate in daily life. And the problem is that if you think about two young people coming together, let's assume that they both are doing relatively well. They're making about $50,000 each. That puts them well above the median for an individual income earner in the United States. They come together as a household. They decide that they're going to have children, right? At 100,000, they are barely meeting that level if they're living in Lynchburg, Virginia. My original piece was referring to Caldwell, New Jersey. That's where the 140,000 basically plays out. You would think making $100,000 between the two of you that you're reasonably well off, even in a place like Caldwell, New Jersey, where again, both individuals are above the median. And unfortunately, that's where you start running into the realities of these incremental costs that you're going to end up incurring. That household that's making 100,000 receives no support from the government.
Right.
They're not going to receive any support from the government until they fall down basically to that 31,200 level and their 32,000 level. And then as they move from that 32,000 level, they encounter what are called benefit cliffs. So, let's pretend, for example, that we have that household, both parents lose their jobs, they qualify for support, they're making less than $30,000. They're getting support from the government in the form of unemployment insurance and rental insurance and subsidized childcare, SNAP benefits for additional food support, and they're getting healthcare assistance, right?
Right.
One of them gets a job back. Suddenly they're making $50,000 as a combined entity. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it turns out it's a bad thing because they end up losing childcare benefits. They end up losing SNAP benefits. So now one of the members of the household has to stay home and take care of the kids, or they have to suddenly incur the high childcare costs out of their own pocket. And the whole point of the piece was basically that move from 30,000 to 100,000, or that move from 100,000 down to 30,000 before they really start to benefit, is called a valley of death. It's effectively a region in which you find yourself working really hard and working harder and harder to try to push yourself ahead, but you're facing incremental taxation in terms of cash costs that make it almost impossible for you to actually move forward and survive and participate without significant support, much of which is going to be withdrawn if you do any better. And so that
Right.
character and that behavior in our society is unquestionably caustic. Part of the reason the piece went so viral is so many people are actually experiencing this, right? There were a number of critics, particularly those on the right, who said something along the lines of, well, that's not poverty. You don't know what poverty is if you think $100,000 a year is poverty. And I would simply argue, sure, I don't know what poverty is if I think $100,000 is, but I would also argue that a subsistence line at 30,000, is not poverty in the classic sense of, you're a hermit living in a cave. But we have an extraordinary
Yeah.
number of individuals and households in the United States that
Mm.
literally are basically living in caves, that are homeless, that are living in tents, that have become disenfranchised members of our society, that are being forced to move back in with their parents, etc. And I would actually argue that the misunderstanding is more on their side of what the actual experience that people are going through, as compared to, a deep misunderstanding of what poverty actually is.
Now I know, Mike, that apart from your work as a strategist and a portfolio manager, you are also a market structure philosopher, and your views are widely sought. Therefore, can you talk about your philosophy about the US macroeconomy in general? This is in the context of what has changed post COVID-19 and now in 26, given the geopolitical volatility due to protracted Russia-Ukraine war and now the Iran situation.
Um, well, I will tell you that most of my views on the macroeconomy are more formed by what I would call much longer moving phenomenon. So to me, one
Right.
of the great ironies is if you go back and you look at the 2005 CBO forecast for the long-term characteristics of the US economy, they almost perfectly lay out what has transpired. Right. In 2005, we knew that our spending on entitlements and our tax policy were mismatched. This is why we introduced the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which we then summarily ignored. If you look at the levels of deficit on an annual basis, if you look at the levels of debt to GDP, if you look at the level of GDP itself, the naive forecast and smooth forecast from the CBO in 2005 was almost spot on, right? They projected
Right.
$19 trillion in 2005 GDP. 2025 ended up being $19.6 trillion, right? It's pretty not bad when you consider this is a government agency projecting forward 20
Right.
years. Levels of unemployment were presumed to be 4.5%. They ended up being 4.3%. The level of debt to GDP was predicted to be about 105%. It ended up being about 103%. So like, and in their forecast, they didn't have a global financial crisis. They didn't have a COVID, pandemic
Right.
shutdown, the stimulus associated with it, et cetera. So it's one of those things that I kind of point to, and I'm like, look, we shouldn't be surprised by where we are. It's not really tied to to the recent events or to recent Fed action or to a failure of the US government in the past couple of years to get its financial house in order. We've known that this was coming for 20 plus years, and we by and large ignored it. And now we're looking for quote unquote easy solutions to a problem that was 20 years in the making that we systematically refuse to address. We know
Right.
what makes economies work. You make good policy decisions, you subsidize that which you want more of, and you tax that which you want less of. Bizarrely, we tax labor much higher than we tax corporate profits. There's a combination of FICA expenses, which don't show up as income taxes. These are the supports for Medicare and Social Security. Those continue to be the largest taxes that most individual workers pay. Not only their taxes are high on that, but we then charge businesses for that same privilege of hiring people with their FICA tax components. We then turn around and we've changed our tax policy to effectively make it much easier for those at the high end, much more challenging and more regressive for those at the low
Right.
end. We've radically reduced corporate taxes, which are primarily borne by those at the extreme high end. We've enabled consolidation and monopolization by ignoring our antitrust legislation in favor of the building of national monopolies or national champions, as we may call them. And we've gone even further, and this has been true for well over 100 years. We have systematically advantaged the use of debt and corporate structure over that of the household and use of equity. And the tax deductibility of debt, for example, why the government is involved in a financing decision, I have absolutely no idea. But interestingly enough, that tax is deductible at the corporate level. It's not tax deductible at the individual level. So,
Right.
if a corporation borrows to buy a car, they get to deduct the interest. If you borrow to buy a car, you don't get to deduct the interest. Why? That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Right. And so those logical inconsistencies, I would argue, are by and large what have led us to the point that we are today, in which we are a debt-heavy, debt-focused system with a overdose of effectively corporatism.
Okay.
So I don't think it's so much the short-moving components as much as it is the longer-term policy incoherence and misunderstanding of what we were really trying to accomplish that has brought us to this point.
Taking attention to central bank balance sheets, Mike. If we compare the Fed and the ECB balance sheets asset side, ECB seems to be normalizing its balance sheet to pre-pandemic levels much faster than the Fed. So the question is, Mike, why is the Fed slow in your opinion? Is it because it wants to remain accommodative amidst multiple point of views being expressed in the market?
I don't think so, actually. I think the biggest component of the bank balance sheet at this point is really just Federal Reserve, reserves held at the Fed. Um, those have shrunk alongside the increase in interest rates. But the really critical thing to understand about the quantity of reserves is that we pay interest on them in order to prevent interest rates from collapsing in the private sector. And that I think is actually probably the much bigger story, which is that we have an implicit subsidy that now exists for the banking industry that is not really a pass through. It's effectively a way of subsidizing a damaged sector of the economy that, again, we don't clearly articulate what its role is in our society anymore. It appears basically to be a channel into the non-depository financial space. But getting rid of that is going to require an awful lot of uh, discipline for the very simple reason that the banking lobby is obviously quite happy receiving that subsidy right now. So I'm not as convinced as others that it's so much about maintaining easy financial conditions as much as it is perversely about supporting a banking system that doesn't have a necessarily clear role in the way that it used to in financing actual economic activity.
Right. Some observers, Mike, are arguing that large central bank balance sheets may actually challenge monetary policy independence, complicate communication, or even entangle central banks in fiscal policy obligations. Keen to know your thoughts on that, Mike.
Yeah, that's effectively what I was just alluding to, right? If you
Yeah.
are paying interest on excess reserves, you are engaged actually in fiscal policy, not monetary policy. If
Right.
you hike
Mm.
interest rates in an environment in which there is a sizable fraction of short-dated financial instruments that are linked to that interest rate, and that is being paid in deficit financing, then you're effectively fiscal transferring to the wealthy within our society. Um,
Right.
that doesn't seem appropriate, but I'm also not the central banker, so it's not up to me to change that policy. It's up to me to diagnose the implications of it.
Right. U.S. Fiscal trajectory has gained significant attention, Mike, as U.S. fiscal deficit is currently at 5.7% and expected to reach 6.5% by 2036. Given the current US economic outlook and the country's involvement in the West Asia crisis, how do you see the fiscal deficit glide path going ahead?
Well, this is where I keep coming back to the point that I was raising earlier, right? If we go
Mm.
back, I'll pull it up on screen here so you can actually see this. Yeah, I've blown it up. It's not pretty, but it'll work. This is literally the 2005 CBO forecast. And to your point, we're at 5.7, right, in
Yeah.
2026. That puts us right on line with scenarios 2 and 4. Scenario 2 was intermediate spending and lower revenues. Like,
Mhm.
that's what we followed. We cut
Interesting.
taxes and we kept up moderate levels of spending. We managed to get some of Medicare under control. We managed to get Social Security somewhat under control, but not really. And as a result, we're doing exactly what we thought we were going to do. So why this is suddenly getting attention, I'm, to me, this just sounds like what we really want to do is keep corporate taxes low, keep taxes low on high income earners, and cut benefits to those who are increasingly stressed because they have less political voice. I don't actually
Right.
think it's a serious attempt to address the issues. If we were serious about it, we'd talk about raising taxes.
Right. That's very interesting, Mike. So the question is that high debt levels and wider deficits could crowd out more productive spending in the US going ahead. This potential crowding out could impede long-term economic growth and innovation that the current administration actually talks about, especially the focus on the supply side. So currently, the focus remains exclusively on investments in sectors such as defense and AI. Uh, do you think the scenario two you just mentioned will have detrimental effects on the economy, given this reality?
Look, anytime that you have, so first of all, the crowding out phenomenon, it really depends on how you spend it, right?
Yeah.
If you spend the money building infrastructure, if you spend the money building human capital through superior education, if you spend the money on creating more attractive environments for people to participate and come to the United States so that you expand your population through immigration, and that immigration is in turn targeted at productive members of society as compared to simply votes, um, you can solve all sorts of problems, right? I mean, great things can happen if that occurs. If you spend a whole bunch of money to meet the needs of people who are no longer contributing in a productive manner, i.e., spending on seniors who we care a lot about because of what they put into our society and what they created for us, but the simple economic reality is spending money on them is basically throwing money down the drain.
Right.
Um, you know, if we have huge health breakthroughs in the process of understanding what the needs of elderly individuals are, that can be certainly an offset to it. But all of the evidence we have is that the return on investment for spending on old people is quite limited. The return on investment for spending on children and young working age adults is actually extraordinarily high.
Right.
We've simply chosen our priorities wrong.
So, how should the system take care of the elderly then, Mike? I mean, I understand it's less productive, but somebody has to take care of the elderly as a system.
So, one, I'm going to be completely harsh and say that's actually not true. You
Mm.
don't have to take care of the elderly. Let's accept that that is a constraint that we're putting on us for moral purposes. I think that we gain from that as a society because we communicate to people that we value them in our society. We do not allow them to die in poverty in their old age. That's really what the war on poverty was all about. At the same time, we cannot allow that focus to distract us from the need to invest in the next generation. And I would argue that we have largely allowed those who do not vote, the young, to be systematically disenfranchised in this process. So I want us to be very careful in what we articulate. The second thing is that the manner in which we structure our retirement system has a significant impact on the answering that question of who cares for people.
Right.
What we replaced, what we had prior to roughly 1977, was a system that was heavily tied to effectively annuities in retirement, things like defined benefit pension plans. Annuities replace income. They incur a liability on the part of those who are fulfilling that income promise, but they basically guarantee a stable real income level. That stable real income level encourages you to spend in your retirement because you have security in your income. We replace that with a system that effectively encourages people to hoard assets that have unknown income generation capability, things like equities, in order to hopefully exceed their individual uncertainty in their retirement. Am I going to run out of assets before I die? If you just think about that
Right.
mechanically, when you ensure that across a large pool of individuals, you're able to do so much more effectively from an insurance or actuarial framework, right? A million
Right.
people behave with statistical properties. I individually have no idea what my outcome is going to be. That
Right.
means I, as an individual, have to accumulate far more assets than I might actually need because I could be an outlier in terms of the length of my retirement. And I might get quote unquote lucky and die early and have plenty of assets to give to my children. Um, the system, when it's constructed that way, effectively leads to hoarding of financial assets and underspending relative to what you would expect people to spend given those assets, because they themselves are uncertain as to how much they're going to need.
Right.
If the older population that we're subsidizing is underspending, by definition, that reduces incomes to the younger generation that is doing all of the work and contributes to all of the problems and phenomenon that we're currently experiencing. So I would argue, unfortunately, that we're in a situation where we've built a retirement system that meets the idea of we're all rugged individualists, right? And we can all take care of ourselves, but it's radically sub-optimized in an overlapping generation for providing income to a younger generation, which in turn supports the next generation of parents, workers, and ultimately children.
A lot of people might not agree with this point, Mike, but nevertheless, a very interesting point of view. Um,
And
Coming back to the
they're free to disagree. I'd be interested in how they possibly could.
yeah, yeah. Coming back to the Fed, Mike, the median of the March 26 Fed dot plot projections sees the Fed fund rate falling 25 bips in 26 and again 25 bips in 27. However, as compared to 2025, projections in 26 seem to portray a more divided house. Do you think the FOMC members have less clarity as far as where the macroeconomy is headed?
Well, to me, the most interesting thing that came out of the last Fed meeting was individuals like Michelle Bowman, for example, who had advocated
Yeah,
for multiple cuts going into the meeting, suddenly moved to effectively a no-cut type outlook, and then immediately afterwards came out and said, "Oh no, I'm still in favor of three cuts." Right?
right,
That suggests to me that there was conversation effectively about the importance of showing a unified framework for Fed credibility purposes and effectively aligning themselves behind Jerome Powell, largely to oppose President Trump. Now, you can agree with that as a strategy, and candidly, you could disagree with that as a strategy. You could disagree with that as an intent, and you can also argue, I think that's the right strategy, right? I just want to be very, very clear. But it definitely shows that something beyond simple economic outlook really played through. I think the second thing that is unfortunate is that the Fed has increasingly driven itself through a rearview mirror. And we see that in repeated policy error. I would highlight, that if I think about the behavior of interest rates, the most important factor that determines real interest rates is actually the labor force growth. In fact, if you were to pull up, and why don't I do this here? I'll just share my screen again.
Right.
If you were to pull up a forward real rate, so this is looking at a five-year real rate in blue relative to labor force growth. Historically, they've tracked very, very closely, and then we've seen repeated missteps. The Federal Reserve not responding to the increase in the economic growth rate that was starting to materialize as rising inflation into the 2016, 2017, 2018 time period. Jerome Powell aggressively cutting interest rates in 2019 in response to stress in money markets tied to some of those Fed balance sheet components feels like it was very much the wrong policy to have been done in advance. And likewise now, if we actually look at what's happening to labor force growth, it is slowing rapidly. This is the discussion that you're hearing from the Fed around, well, maybe zero jobs is the new break-even level. The simple reality is that means the real rate has to fall. If you just mechanically think about what it means when somebody enters the labor force, we often think about this from the framework of cost push inflation. An increase in the labor force should be a net negative for cost because I've got more people competing for the same jobs. The problem is that ignores why people enter the labor force. The reason people enter the labor force is they want to increase their consumption. And so
Right.
the actual best predictor of inflation is actually labor force growth. It's telling you that demand needs to increase, or the desired state is an increase in demand that needs to be met by productive application of the labor that is available. I just think the Fed has lost sight of this. They think about it from a cost plus standpoint, cost push standpoint. And as a result, they're very focused on the idea that, well, it's perfectly fine if we get to zero job growth, ignoring that the only way that we offset that decline in demand is by raising the real wages of workers so that they can consume more. Otherwise, the economy just doesn't grow. And if you think about the implications of productivity in a stagnant aggregate demand environment, the only way that can manifest itself is through job loss.
But if you adjust this Fed fund rate in real terms with inflation, Mike, then that would be somewhere near the blue line, right?
Yeah, so this is the
Mm.
nominal Fed funds, but
Yeah.
again, the critical component is that even if you were to make that adjustment, you would not end up anywhere near where we currently are. What we're
Okay.
actually seeing is we are seeing real rates held up by Fed policy as compared to anticipating the significant decline. And like I said, prior to the shenanigans around 2008 and the most recent activist Fed, we basically largely tracked, and now we have basically thrown ourselves off kilter. And so we are constantly trying to correct the mistakes that were made. This goes back to the same observation I was making around massaging the rules around community banks, because we changed the regulatory environment and made them largely irrelevant in the process.
Right. Interesting.
And it more broadly speaks to a much bigger issue, which is candidly, I just think that we've had a radical change in the structure of how much of our society works, and the Fed continues to follow the old metrics. One example I would bring up is the continuous downward revisions that we are seeing in non-farm payrolls. The primary reason why that's actually happening is because of what's called the birth-death model. This is an attempt by the BLS to model the formation of new businesses. Um, According to this metric, we are still seeing the highest levels of entrepreneurial job formation basically in history, even as every small business indicator, every sentiment indicator, et cetera, indicates it's not a great time to form a business. Right. Now, why
Right.
is this happening? The reason this is happening is because we changed the methodology of how we calculate the birth death metric. Post-COVID, we changed it, and then we failed to realize that there was a significant structural change in how we reported the underlying driver of this, which is applications for new businesses. The reason why that turned into such a mess was in 2021, we changed the rules around 1099s. We lowered the threshold from $20,000 of income that you could earn in a non-primary employment role and not have to worry about reporting it to the IRS. We lowered that to $600. That created a surge in demand for employee identification numbers that allowed individuals operating in the gig business to expense many of the costs associated with that, the depreciation of your car, gasoline, etc. If you're a
Right.
DoorDash driver and you file for an employee identification number, you say, I'm going into the food services business. Well, the food services business is traditionally associated with catering. You may have worked in college as a bartender or caterer, and you know that catering businesses hire a lot of people to do jobs. The BLS assumed that those were high propensity job formation businesses and projected a lot of business formation and jobs associated with it. But what they were really actually picking up effectively was people losing their jobs or being underemployed and deciding that they're going to drive for DoorDash or for Uber, et cetera. That's led to the data just being wrong. And it's why we're seeing these continuous downward revisions is taking out this inappropriate birth death adjustment figure. If we look at job growth excluding that birth death framework, it's been on a downward trend, not just for the past couple of years, but legitimately ex-COVID, it's been in a downward trend for well over a decade now. So we're actually looking at an economy that has net negative job creation. And if we go even a step further and we look at this most recent positive job report that came through that everybody's seizing on, the San Francisco Fed has actually come out with an improved weather calculation, and they're saying, no, that's not true, right? It actually turns out that 170,000 jobs was negative 79,000. This is before we adjust for the birth death component that I'm talking about. So the Fed is just looking at the wrong data. It's just that straightforward. So we ended up in a situation where, one, I would argue that the Fed is increasingly driving itself through the rear view mirror. That's what data dependent means. We're going to wait for the data and then we're going to make our choices, as compared to trying to build a model for what the economy looks like on a go forward basis, which is really the only way that you could pretend to manage an economy. And then when we look in our review mirror, it's like we forgot to put on our glasses, right? So we're
Right.
staring through at fuzzy things, and we're, latching ourselves onto things that used to make sense. When we talk about unemployment claims, it presumes that when people lose their jobs, they file for unemployment. Well, unemployment benefits across most states have not been adjusted for inflation for going on 15 years. The traditional model of unemployment benefits is they were supposed to replace about 65% of the median workers' compensation. Today, unemployment benefits only replace about 25% of the median workers' compensation. As a result, there's very little incentive to file for unemployment. Likewise, businesses have learned that if they manage employees out of the process without them filing for unemployment, that lowers their unemployment insurance costs. And so they do everything they possibly can to conceal the level of unemployment that's occurring, including things like facilitating people, starting their own businesses, driving for Uber, et cetera, providing periods of unemployment compensation, effectively, a workout period that allows them to claim they didn't become unemployed, right? They were on our system for long enough that they don't qualify anymore. These are all things that are concealing the level of unemployment that we're seeing. And the last thing that is concealing that in a very major way is actually the composition of our society. So historically, we used to have a much higher fraction of people who worked in cyclical trades industries or seasonal trades industries. Today, we have a growing fraction of the younger generation that has a college degree and presumes they're going to work in an office in a 9 to 5 type framework on a consistent basis. The unemployment levels, if we look at them on an educational basis, are very much at odds with history. And I can pull that up. Let's see here, unemployment by education. I think this is going to pull it up. Yeah, there we go. Love it when a plan comes together. So instead of looking at an absolute rate, this is looking at the Z-score across education. This is the overall average. We're currently running below average in terms of overall unemployment, but for college grads, it's now at a positive Z-score. For those with less than a college degree, it's operating at significantly lower than a zero Z-score, or in other words, in line. This is unfortunately what we're seeing. And again, it's concentrated in the youth. It's concentrated in an environment, in an area that has historically had very low unemployment metrics. This is one of the reasons why people pay the premium to go to college, because it ostensibly makes better job opportunities available to them.
Yeah.
But this is a complexity that I would argue is by and large missing from the analysis. We need to accept that we have a different setup than we've ever had historically. If we go back and look at 2000, it was the exact opposite. Today, this is where you're hearing the abandonment of the learn to code refrain that we told everybody for about a decade. And instead, we're suddenly telling people you should learn how to be a plumber. That's a pretty significant
Yeah.
degradation of social standing when you
Yeah.
really think.
But isn't that a trend that is happening since the 1970s, Mike?
The trend towards higher education, you're saying, that's actually been in place for
No,
200 years.
I mean, people until the 1970s were able to find jobs even out of high school, and they
Yep.
could build their own houses. And I think the 73 war, things have been different, right? I mean, even after a college degree, people don't find jobs and are able to build their homes and families.
Yeah, I think this falls under the category of why did that happen? Unfortunately, I would
Mm.
argue that those policies were already in place at that point in time. The really critical thing that began to happen in the 1970s is that we began to move away from traditionally liberal frameworks of the government is there to provide a safety net, the government is,
Mm.
employing a larger and larger fraction of the population. We, by and large, have seen particularly federal government employment shrink dramatically over the past several decades. State and local government and administrative employment has risen significantly. But I think, unfortunately, that once again is largely misinterpreted, right? When people think of the government, they aren't specifying whether it's state, local, and federal. They see it as somewhat of a monolith. Um, the competition with the government sector for good, high caliber individuals has materially decreased. Instead, government employment has increasingly become a form of social subsidy to a much lower skilled cohort, and that has degraded the quality of services at the same time that public sector unionization has effectively protected the income levels. Today, somebody with a high school degree going to work for the government makes 168% premium to what they would get in the private sector.
Right.
Somebody with an advanced degree gets about a 15% discount versus what they would get in the private sector. And so there's been a natural downgrading of the skill opportunity. And as we see this relative tightness shift, as I highlighted in the educational component, the simultaneous loss of the backstop of, oh, I can go be a teacher or I can go work for the government has been exacerbated. And now you have college graduates who are becoming baristas, right? Or potentially plumbers.
Right. Right. Very interesting perspectives indeed, Mike. Finally, Mike, keen to know your philosophy on putting to the Fed its next course of action, its new leadership under Warsh, and what the Fed ought to be doing in the current circumstances.
Well, again, unfortunately, I think the Fed is trapped. It has to make a decision. Is it going to continue to increase or allow an increase in the interest income channel where the high levels of interest on a high level of debt to GDP effectively create a sizable fiscal transfer to a subset of our population? Or are they going to choose to step in and try to protect the credit sensitive portions of our economy? My hunch is that their hands are going, that they think they are in charge currently and have the luxury of waiting. And unfortunately, I think the incipient credit issues that are emerging in private credit lower income households, younger households, smaller business more broadly, are eventually going to force their hand. And, we will see them forced to cut. When they cut, they will reduce the interest income channel that's flowing through to the older generation, and that will likely
Right.
impact the discretionary spending coming from that sector. And we'll see the Fed, move back to what we used to call pushing on a string. So I'm
Right.
not sure that they have a great series of choices, but again, I think that should be expected when you have an economy that was largely defined in many of its characteristics 20 years ago quite successfully by the CBO, and we did nothing to address the issues.
Incredible, Mike. Well, on that note, that's all I have for today. Mike,
Awesome.
thank you so much for the time. It was a pleasure, and I'm sure the audience will greatly benefit from your insights and market philosophies.
They will scream at the screen if nothing else. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mike, for the time.
Take care.
Thank you.